Okay, good morning. A little disorganized this morning, but here we are. And we're ready for some more reading. And I didn't even get my book down yet. There we go. Not used to doing this daytime streaming stuff. So, anyway. Here we are, and we are still reading in Forbidden History. We're getting about halfway point. And we've got, let's see, one. Okay, so about 2 articles about roughly 6 pages each. One's got a couple of big pictures, so it's actually 8 pages, but it's got pictures. So anyway, let's just jump right on into this next article, which is Article 19, The Aegean Atlantis Deception. Was Plato's grand tale nothing more than the saga of an insignificant Greek island? By Frank Joseph. All right. Although Atlantis was generally associated by most investigators with the Atlantic Ocean, as a preponderance of the evidence suggests, fringe theorists have occasionally assigned the island to sometimes bizarre locations, almost always for ulterior reasons. The latest of these eccentric interpretations gained some acceptance among professional archaeologists and historians. Wow, historians. Probably because it did not disturb their modern bias against transoceanic voyages in pre-classical times. The theory originally belonged to a pre-World War I writer for the Journal of Hellenic Studies, K.T. Frost, who moved Atlantis from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mediterranean island of Crete. Since then, his hypothesis has been expanded by, perhaps not surprisingly, mostly Greek scholars. Galanopoulos, Marinatos et al., to include the Aegean island of Santorini, anciently known as Thera. Their advocation of a Greek identity for Atlantis was the latest in an unfortunate chauvinist tendency on the part of some Atlantologists to associate their own national backgrounds with the lost civilization. Such extra scientific motivations for conveniently finding Plato's Island in the investigator's own homeland have not done the search much credit, but the ulterior motives currently driving professional scholars of all nationalities, mostly Americans these days, to insist that Crete or its neighboring island and Atlantis are one and the same are more harmful. It is important, therefore, to understand why they want to explain away Atlantis in what has come to be known as the Minoan hypothesis. Thera was part of the Minoan commercial empire, and excavation on Santorini, its modern name, uncovered a high level of early civilization that once flourished there. The small island was actually a volcanic mountain that exploded in much the same way as the eruption at Krakatoa and quite literally plunged into the sea. The resulting 200-foot-high wall of water that swept over Crete wreaked havoc among its coastal ports, while accompanying earthquakes badly damaged the inland capital, Knossos. The Minoans were knocked so off balance by this natural disaster that they could not organize an effective resistance to Mycenaean aggression, and their civilization disappeared, absorbed in part by invaders from Greece. Seizing upon these events more than 1,000 years before his time, Plato, it is suggested, modeled Atlantis directly after Crete and or Thera as an analogy for his ideal state. Although Thera is only a fraction of the size of his Atlantis and lies in the Aegean Sea instead of the Atlantic Ocean, which he specified, and was destroyed 7,800 years after the destruction described in the dialogues, these apparent discrepancies are handily dismissed by the assumption that Plato simply inflated his account by a factor of 10. He did so, it is claimed, deliberately, to make for a grander tale. His figures were mistranslated from the original Egyptian. Excuse me. Both Atlanteans and Minoans, it is argued, built great palaces and powerful cities, operated thalassocracies, seaborne empire. Oh, okay. Seaborne empires. I've never seen that word before, but it actually defines it, so. Practiced a pillar cult, traded in precious metals, and had elephants roaming about. This interpretation is not without supporting details. Eumelos, E-U-M-E-L-O-S, I'm going to say Eumelos, cited by Plato in the Critias as the first Atlantean king after Atlantis, is echoed in the Minoan island of Melos, and in fact is mentioned on an inscription of archaic Greek at Thera itself bearing his name. The Minoan theorists go on to argue against the Atlantic Ocean as the correct site for Plato's island because only in the Aegean Sea have relatively small tracts of land ever suddenly disappeared beneath the surface, such as the city of Helice in the Gulf of Corinth. The Azores, too, are ruled out as a possible location. Supposedly, no islands in the area are known to have sunk over the past 72,000 years. The numerous early flood legends, particularly the Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh, are cited as literary evidence for Thera's destruction. Even the concentric arrangement of the Atlantean capital, as described by Plato, may to this day be seen in the waters of Santorini Bay. It is true that, like Atlantis, Thera was a volcanic island and part of an advanced thalassocracy, which vanished after its chief mountain exploded and sank into the sea, but move beyond this general comparison and the Minoan hypothesis begins to unravel. Thera was a minor colony of Minoan civilization, a small outpost, not its capital. As the dialogues have Atlantis, Mycenaean influences from the Greek mainland did supplant Minoan culture on Crete, but the transition appears to have been largely, if not entirely, non-violent. Certainly nothing resembling the scope of Plato's Atlanto-Athenian War that raged across the Mediterranean world. The Minoans never made a move to occupy Italy or Libya, nor did they threaten to invade Egypt, as the Atlanteans were supposed to have done. From everything scholars have been able to learn about them, the Minoans were an extremely unwarlike people, more interested in commercial than military conquests, while the Atlanteans are portrayed as aggressively bellicose. As Kenneth Caroli, a leading writer on the subject, concludes, quote, Thera's candidacy as Atlantis rests largely on its cataclysmic destruction alone, while Plato's story had far more to do with a war between two antagonistic peoples than with the disaster that later overwhelmed them both. End quote. Okay. So, I'll show you these two pictures real quick. The first one is labeled the volcano of Santorini. Let's see if I can do this. This is the volcano at Santorini. I know it's not all that clear. Okay. And then the other one is modern Thera with its popular association with Atlantis has developed a thriving tourist industry. And that's all you get. That's the best I can show you. All right. I can't even make out what that's supposed to be. I mean, there's a city off to the one side and the ocean to the other, but doesn't really show me much. Okay. A case of mistaken identity. The Minoans operated a dynamic navy to combat piracy and keep open the sea routes of international trade, but their Cretan cities were not ringed by high walls or battlements of any kind. Compare Knossos or Phaistos with the armed towers and defense in depth of the walls surrounding Atlantis. Moreover, these leading cities of Minoan Crete were laid out in the architectural canon of the square grid, unlike the concentric circles upon which Atlantis was built. Some theorists claim to have actually seen such a concentric arrangement underwater within the bay created when Thera's volcanic mountain collapsed into the sea. But Dorothy B. Vitaliano, a prominent geologist specializing in volcanology with the U.S. Geological Survey, reports that the subsurface topography at Santorini, quote, was not in existence before the Bronze Age eruption of the volcano. It has been created by the subsequent activity which built up the Kameni Islands in the middle of the bay, to which a substantial amount of land was added as recently as 1926. Any traces of the pre-collapse topography would long since have been buried beneath the pile of lava whose highest portions emerge to form these islands, end quote. Clearly, a recent geological feature has been mistaken for an ancient city. Structures designed in concentric circles prevailed, not in the Mediterranean world, but in the Atlantic, such as the circular temples of the Canary Islands and Britain's Stonehenge. Caroli points out that, quote, the Atlantean capital lay on a substantial plain surrounded by high mountains on a large island, end quote. Thera does not fit this description. And there's a third picture, Minoan bull ceremony. Why they included that, I don't know. Let's see. Going the wrong way. I'm not sure how well you can see that. I see a bull and a dude. It's the best I can make out of it. Two guys, I guess. One in front of the bull, one behind. The Cretans and Therans did not plate floors, walls, and columns with metal, as Plato says the Atlanteans did. Plato's description of Poseidon's temple implies a structure with metal-covered walls, decorative pinnacles, and at least two pillars that were metal-plated. All this sounds like a Bronze Age Phoenician temple. Atlantis featured interconnecting canals and lay close to the sea. Phaistos and Knossos are inland and have no canals. Nothing of the kind existed at Knossos or any other Minoan city. Neither of these Aegean locations had a harbor because their lightweight ships could be hauled up on the beach, unlike the ocean-going Atlantean ships, which required the deep water ports mentioned in the Critias. In any case, the harbor arrangement described by Plato was impossible in the eastern Mediterranean Sea because its main channel would have been fouled by stagnation without the ebb and flow of tides that do occur beyond the Pillars of Heracles. This point alone is sufficient to prove that he was describing a real place in the Atlantic Ocean, not in the Aegean. Melos, the Minoan island associated with the king Eumelos, there's that word one again, Eumelos, Eumelos of Plato's dialogues, is so tiny that it could never have supported the capital of an allied kingdom. Actually, we learn in the Critias that Eumelos ruled over that region closest to the Pillars of Heracles called Gades, Gades, today's Cadiz, on the Atlantic coast of Spain. That much in Plato is certain. It takes quite a stretch of the imagination to say nothing of the facts to relocate Eumelos in the Aegean, although it is the only name mentioned in the dialogues that does indeed appear in the eastern Mediterranean. No other Atlantean king finds a correspondence in that part of the world. The islands of Atlantis was supposed, one island, of Atlantis was supposed to have been rich in precious metals. Crete and Thera have few. Then there is the self-evident fact that Crete did not sink into the sea, as Atlantis was alleged to have done. Thera's volcanic mountain did collapse beneath the Aegean, but its island survives to this day. In the Critias, both city and island were utterly destroyed. That rituals involving bulls were practiced by both Atlantean and Minoan civilization proves nothing, because the animal was similarly venerated in mainland Greece, Egypt, Assyria, the Hittite Empire, and Iberia as far back as Neolithic and even Paleolithic times. An ocean of sunken islands. Contrary to the Minoan theorists, who assert that no sizable territories have sunk into the Atlantic Ocean as recently as 1931, the Fernando Noronha Islands were points of contention between Great Britain and Portugal until they sank after 1 week of seismic activity. Nor was Atlantis the only island city to have gone under the Atlantic. The Genonius map of 1649 identified Usedom, Usedom, formerly a famous mart, which was swallowed up by the waves of the sea. The same island was mentioned 5 centuries earlier by the Arab cartographer Edrisi. Actually, the town in question was Veneta, on the southwest corner of the island of Usedom, near Rugen Island in the North Sea. The North Frisian island of Rungholt, although not as large as Usedom, was likewise once inhabited before it sank at about the same time. Of course, none of these islands may be identified with Atlantis, but each does demonstrate that an Atlantean event was by no means beyond the geologic purview of the Atlantic Ocean. That was actually some rough sentences there. Rough for me to read, anyway. Okay. A labyrinth of misinformation. As for the flood legend common to the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Old Testament, and early myth, it cannot have resulted from the destruction of Thera, because the deluge myth prominent in Middle Eastern civilization traces back to Sumerian origins, predating the downfall of Minoan Crete by more than 1,000 years. The Greek tradition of Theros, the mythic founder of Thera, has no elements in common with Plato's story, nor does it hint of anything remotely Atlantean. The Minoan hypothesis was so much in vogue among the archaeologists during the 1970s that the famed oceanographer Jacques Cousteau spent the better part of his time, energies, and nearly $2 million provided by the government of Monaco searching the depths around Santorini, lured to the Aegean by a fashionable theory designed to dismiss Plato, not explain him. Cousteau turned up nothing resembling Atlantis. A confusion of dates. While at first glance and from a distance the Minoan hypothesis may appear tenable, it begins to disintegrate the closer one approaches it. Practically point for point, the Aegean Atlantis does not match Plato's straightforward account and is uniformly contradicted by the evidence of geology, history, and comparative mythology. As a last-ditch effort to save something of their excuse for a Cretan interpretation, it advocates claim that Plato merely used the general outline of events at Thera as a vague historical framework on which to present his notion of a consummate culture in the fictionalized guise of Atlantis. But here, too, they err, because the dialogue defines Atlantis as the enemy of Plato's idealized state. So often has it been repeated that he invented Atlantis to exemplify his ideal society. In any case, the ideal city Plato does describe, Megara, is square, not circular. But only one piece of evidence is required to invalidate the Minoan hypothesis in a single stroke. The cornerstone its supporters depend upon was the date for the collapse of Thera's volcano into the sea, because it was this disaster, they argued, that brought down Minoan civilization in 1485 BCE. The attendant tsunamis that crashed along the shores of ancient Crete and the earthquakes that toppled her cities were compounded by Greek armies who took advantage of the natural catastrophe to wage war on the disorganized Minoans, plunging them into a dark age from which they never re-emerged. The pivotal date was arrived at by a process of ice core drilling, Curley explains. Quote, ice cores reveal acidity peaks. Oh, that's the end of the quote. At the times of major eruptions, because ash falls on the ice caps and affects their chemistry. Long cores by hollow pipes used as drills, some hundreds of feet in length, taken from both Greenland and Antarctica, have been examined to determine the past climate of the Earth. Quote, by analyzing the chemistry of these cores, acidity peaks can be found, he says, many of them visible to the naked eye as dark streaks in the ice made by the ash that fell long ago. Some of these cores, mainly those from Greenland, have annual layers like tree rings or sedimentary glacial deposits at lake bottoms. These can and have been counted back for thousands of years. The oldest of these long cores was drilled in 1963 at Camp Century in north-central Greenland. For years, it was the only core that went back far enough to have studied in sufficient detail and had been studied in sufficient detail to potentially reveal the timing of Thera's eruption. End quote. It is now understood that Thera erupted between 1623 and 1628 BCE, almost 150 years earlier than the Minoan theorists believed. The significance of this discrepancy renders their entire interpretation invalid because Minoan civilization did not disappear in the wake of a natural disaster. Quote, by all indications, Caroli points out, the Minoans not only survived the eruption, but reached their peak after it. End quote. Proponents of an Aegean Atlantis call upon Egyptian history for corroboration, but here too they find contradiction to their assertion that Minoan civilization was shattered by Thera's eruption. Pharaoh Amenhotep III dispatched an embassy to the cities of Crete and found them still occupied nearly a century after their supposed destruction. The Egyptian records were confirmed in the late 1970s when excavators around Knossos discovered evidence for the final occupation by the Minoans in 1380 BCE. This was 100 years later than even the original incorrect date for the eruption of Thera and its assumed destruction of Aegean civilization, the alleged source for Plato's story of Atlantis. We're getting there. Caroli's assessment seemed conclusive. Quote, and so the Minoan hypothesis is left with no war, no maritime civilization destroyed by catastrophe, the wrong kind of disaster, the wrong date, and no comparable dark age as a result. What does this leave us? To my mind, not much. End quote, and end article. So, yeah, that one, it's interesting. I'd never heard of some of those other islands with cities on them sinking into the ocean, like the ones in the North Sea. I have never heard of those. That's very interesting. It's probably still an extremely rare occurrence, but not as rare as I thought. You know, Krakatoa is a famous one. Um, this one at Crete I had never heard of. So that's all pretty interesting. I've never really read much about the Minoans though, so it's not surprising I'd never heard of that. And history class was decades ago, so if it was ever even mentioned, I probably never knew it. At least would never have remembered it, because if it was just mentioned in passing, how would you remember that decades later? Unless you have a, you know, what do they call it? Mimetic memory? Is that the right word? I don't remember. Because I don't have that. Anyway, so the next one is another 6 pages. Yep. So we'll jump into it. Unless anybody has anything to say, please feel free in chat to share any thoughts you have, whether it's on the history of it, debating it, you know, whatever, or if you're into TTRPGs and you had a thought based on those theories. I mean, it gives me some ideas on the world building that I'm doing um, to incorporate just for history, for lore in the world. So I'm going to make some notes on that later. But anyway, let's jump into the next one. It is 11:30. We're doing good. So this is Article 20, Atlantology, psychotic or inspired. Media stereotypes aside, what kind of person pursues knowledge of a forgotten civilization? By Frank Joseph. I think the last one was by Frank Joseph. Yes, it was. Okay, so this has little tiny pictures of Ceylon, Poseidon. I'm not going to bother showing that Rudolf Steiner, Louis Spence. They're so small you wouldn't be able to make out anything on the camera, so I won't bother showing them. A mainstream archaeologist interviewed about Atlantis on a recent special for the Discovery Channel declared that the only people who believe in such garbage are cranks, fools, and charlatans. His assessment is shared by conventional scientists who insist that no one of any intellectual worth would demean him or herself by seriously considering any sunken civilization. True, virtually no university-trained researchers today are willing to risk the wrath of conservative academics not above sabotaging the careers of independent mind colleagues. Now, I actually take exception to that. Conservative academics is an oxymoron. Very few academics are conservative in any way, shape, or form. They're all, some of them, way out there to the left. And that's their choice. Not knocking it, I'm just saying. He's trying to say that they're conservatives and therefore they're stuffy old men that don't want to hear this stuff. No, it's more like they don't want to risk their paycheck. That's all they care about. A whole lot of research is shoved aside or buried because it risks somebody's paycheck. All right. But contrary to the establishment's defaming characterization of those interested in the historical possibility of Atlantis, the subject has for centuries attracted some of the best brains in the world. Solon, one of the 7 wise men of Greece, introduced social reforms and a legal code that formed the political basis of classical civilization. He was also the first great poet of Athens. In the late 6th century BCE, the great lawgiver traveled to Sais. It's Sais. I've run into that before, but I still don't know how to pronounce it. Sais, the Nile Delta capital of the 26th dynasty, where the Temple of Neith was located. Here, a history of Etalenti, I'll go with that, Etalenti, was preserved in hieroglyphs inscribed or painted on dedicated columns, which were translated for him by the high priest Sonchus. Returning to Greece, Solon worked all the details of the account into an epic poem, Atlantikos, but was distracted by political problems from completing the project before his death in 560 BCE. About 150 years later, the unfinished manuscript was given to Plato, who formed 2 dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, from it. As one of the very greatest historical figures in classical Greek history, Solon's early connection with the story of Atlantis lends it formidable credibility. But neither he nor Plato was the only towering figure of classical antiquity to embrace the reality of Atlantis. Statius Sebosus was a Greek geographer and contemporary of Plato, mentioned by the Roman scientist Pliny the Elder for his detailed description of Atlantis. All the works of Statius Sebosus were lost with the fall of classical civilization. Dionysius of Miletus was known as Scytobrachion. Skytobrachian, I've never seen that either, for his prosthetic leather arm. Um, wrote, so he was known as Skytobrachian for his prosthetic leather arm, wrote A Voyage to Atlantis around 550 BCE, predating not only Plato but also Solon. A copy of Dionysius's manuscript was found among the personal papers of the historical writer Pierre Benoit. Tragically, it was lost between the restorers and borrowers who made use of this valuable piece of resource material after Benoit's death. And, another Greek historian, Dionysius of Mytilene, sorry if I'm butchering these names, 430 to 367 BCE, relying on pre-classical sources, reported that, quote, from its deep-rooted base, the Phlegian island, which stern Poseidon shook and plunged beneath the waves with its impious inhabitants, end quote. The Atlantic island of Atlantis, the volcanic island of Atlantis is suggested in the fiery Phlegian isle destroyed by the sea god. Tragically, this is all that survives from a lengthy discussion of Atlantis in the lost Argonautica, mentioned 400 years later by the Greek geographer Diodorus Siculus as one of his major sources for information about the ancient history of North Africa. Interestingly, Dionysius was a contemporary of Plato. A utopian novel written by Francis Bacon in 1629, The New Atlantis, was the first written discussion of Atlantis since the fall of classical civilization and probably sparked Athanasius Kircher's interest in the subject. He published his own scientific study of Atlantis in The Subterranean World 36 years later. Although a work of fiction, The New Atlantis came about through excited discussions in contemporary scholar circles of reports from travelers to America. They said that the indigenous peoples had oral accounts of a land comprising numerous points in common with Plato's sunken civilization. They even called it Aztlan, which paralleled a native version of the Greek Atlantis. The New Atlantis actually incorporates some Atlanto-American myths Bacon heard repeated in London. A German polymath of the 17th century, the Jesuit priest Athanasius Kircher, was a pioneering mathematician, physicist, chemist, linguist, and archaeologist. He was the first to study phosphorescence, and he was the inventor of numerous futuristic innovations, including the slide projector and a prototype of the microscope. The founding father of scientific Egyptology, he led the first serious investigation of temple hieroglyphs. Kircher was also the first scholar to seriously investigate the Atlantis legend. Initially skeptical, he cautiously began reconsidering its credibility while assembling mythic traditions about a great flood from numerous cultures in various parts of the world. Quote, I confess for a long time I had regarded all this, he said of various European traditions of Atlantis, as pure fables to the day when better instructed in Oriental languages, I judged that all these legends must be, after all, only the development of a great truth. End quote. His research led him to the immense collection of source materials at the Vatican Library, where, as Europe's foremost scholar, he had at his disposal all its formidable resources. It was here that he discovered a single piece of evidence that proved to him that the legend was actually fact. Among the relatively few surviving documents from Imperial Rome, Kircher found a well-preserved treated leather map purporting to show the configuration and location of Atlantis. The map was not Roman, but had been brought in the 1st century CE to Italy from Egypt, where it had been executed. It survived the demise of classical times and found its way into the Vatican Library. I would love to know what's actually in the Vatican Library, but you have to. I think the last I knew of it, you had to have at least a master's degree and had to be very specific on what you wanted to look at and name the source, the exact book. Um, and if it's a volume in a series, you have to name the exact volume, and they get that out for you. And if what you're looking for isn't in it, you got, one volume off. Tough. Come back tomorrow and you can look at that one. It's really very, very strictly regulated, and it just makes me suspicious of what's actually there. Because like I said, you have to actually know what it is you want. You can't just go, I want to look for information on XYZ subject. You have to go, I want this volume 3 of such and such. So you have to know it exists. Really pretty fucked up, in my opinion. Where was I? Um, Among the relatively few surviving documents from Imperial Rome, that's the map. Okay, here we go. Kircher copied it precisely, the leather map, adding only a visual reference to the New World, and published it in the Subterranean World. His caption describes it as a map of the island of Atlantis, originally made in Egypt after Plato's description, which suggests it was created sometime following the 4th century CE, perhaps by a Greek mapmaker attached to the Ptolemies. More probable, the map's first home was the Great Library of Alexandria, from which numerous books and references to Atlantis were lost, along with another million-plus volumes, when the institution was burned by religious fanatics. By relocating to Rome, the map escaped that destruction. That's another one. The Library of Alexandria. God, what wouldn't people give to be able to see what was in there? Similar to modern conclusions forced by current understanding of geology in the mid-Atlantic ridge, Kircher's map depicts Atlantis not as a continent but as a large island about the size of Spain and France combined. It shows a tall, centrally located volcano, most likely meant to represent Mount Atlas, together with 6 major rivers, something Plato does not mention. The Critias speaks of large rivers on the island of Atlantis, but we are not told how many. Although the map vanished after Kircher's death in 1680, it was the only known representation of Atlantis to have survived the ancient world. Thanks to his research and book, it survives today in what is considered to be a close copy of the original. Kircher was the first to publish such a map, probably the most accurate of its kind to date. Curiously, it is depicted upside down, contrary to maps in both his day and ours. Yet this apparent anomaly is proof of the map's authenticity, because Egyptian mapmakers, even as late as Ptolemaic times, designed their maps with the Upper Nile Valley, located in the south, upper refers to the higher elevation, at the top, because the river's headwaters are located in the Sudan. That's right. The Nile runs south to north. A lot of people forget that. Olaf Rudbeck, 1630 to 1702, was Sweden's premier scientific genius. professor of medicine, Uppsala, discoverer of the lymph glands, inventor of the anatomical theater dome, leading pioneer of modern botany, designer of the first university gardens, initiator of Latin as the lingua franca of the scientific world community, historian of early Sweden. A brilliant scholar, fluent in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, Rudbeck possessed a grasp of classical literature that was nothing less than encyclopedic. Combining his vast knowledge of the ancient world with personal archaeological research in his own country, he concluded during a long, intense period of investigation from 1651 to 1698, that is a long period, that Atlantis was fact, not fiction, and the greatest civilization in prehistory. He believed that Norse myths, and some physical evidence among his country's megalithic ruins showed how a relatively few Atlantean survivors may have had an impact on Sweden, contributing to its cultural development, and laid the foundation, particularly in ship construction, for what would much later be remembered as the Viking Age, the 9th to 12th centuries CE. Critics have also misrepresented Rudbeck's work by claiming he identified Sweden with Atlantis itself, but he never made such an assertion. In their sloppy research, they have confused him with another 18th century scholar, the French astronomer Jean Bailly. I'm just going to say the Americanized version of it, who concluded, before being executed during the French Revolution, that Spitsbergen in the Arctic Ocean was all that remained of Atlantis. Born in Kraljevic, Austria, on February 27, 1861, Rudolf Steiner was a university-trained scientist, artist, and editor who founded a Gnostic movement based on comprehension of the spiritual world through pure thought and the highest faculties of mental knowledge. This was the guiding principle of anthroposophy, knowledge produced by the higher self in man, as he defined it, a spiritual perception independent of the senses. Such instinctual awareness of the divine energies that interpenetrate the entire universe is not new. On the contrary, it was exercised by our ancestors during the deep past when they more freely and fully participated in the spiritual processes of life. A gradual attraction to the vulgar materialism through development of the high cultures in the ancient world increasingly diminished their innate sensitivities, which eventually atrophied but did not die out. Okay, we're in the last 2 pages. To awaken these faculties, dormant in all men and women, Steiner believed, training their consciousness to look beyond mere matter. These concepts were developed in his 1904 book, Cosmic Memory, Prehistory of Earth and Man. Excuse me. He maintained that before Atlantis gradually sank in 7227 BCE, its earliest inhabitants formed one of mankind's root races, a people who did not require speech but instead communicated telepathically in images, not words, as part of their immediate experience with God. According to Steiner, the story of Atlantis was dramatically revealed in Germanic myth, wherein fiery Muspelheim corresponded to the southern volcanic area of the Atlantic island, while frosty Niflheim was located in the north. Steiner wrote that the Atlanteans developed the first concept of good versus evil and laid the groundwork for all ethical and legal systems. Their leaders were spiritual initiates, able to manipulate the forces of nature through control of the life force and development of etheric technology. Ooh. I'm liking some of this stuff. It's giving me some ideas. 7 epochs comprise the post-Atlantis period, of which ours, the Euro-American epoch, will end in CE 3573. So we've got some time. Cosmic memory goes on to describe the earlier and contemporary Pacific civilization of Lemuria, with stress on the highly evolved clairvoyant powers of its people. Steiner defined Atlantis as the turning point in an ongoing struggle between the human search for community and our experience of individuality. The former, which is growing with its growing emphasis on materialism, dragged down the spiritual needs of the latter, culminating eventually in the Atlantean cataclysm. In this interpretation of the past, Steiner opposed Marxism. To him, spirit, not economics, drives history. Steiner's views of Atlantis and Lemuria are important, if only because of the educational Waldorf movement he founded, which still operates about 100 schools attended by tens of thousands of students in Europe and the United States. He died on March 30th, 1925, in Dornach, Switzerland, where he had founded his School of Spiritual Science 12 years earlier. James Lewis Thomas Chalmers Spence, born on November 25, 1874, in Forfarshire, Scotland, was a prominent mythologist who inherited Ignatius Donnelly's position as the world's leading Atlantologist. Oh, Ignatius Donnelly. Yeah, okay, I remember that guy. Leading Atlantologist of the early 20th century. An alumnus of Edinburgh University, Spence was made a Fellow of the Royal Anthropology Institute of Great Britain and Ireland and elected Vice President of the Scottish Anthropology and Folklore Society. Awarded a royal pension for service to culture, he published more than 40 books, many of them, such as the Dictionary of Non-Classical Mythology, co-authored with Marion Edwards, are still in print and widely regarded as the best source materials of their kind. His interpretation of the Maya's Popol Vuh, Book of Consol, won international acclaim, but he is best remembered for The Problem of Atlantis, 1924, Atlantis in America, 1925, The History of Atlantis, 1926, Will Europe Follow Atlantis, 1942, and The Occult Sciences in Atlantis, 1943. During the early 1930s, he edited a prestigious journal, the Atlantis Quarterly. The Problem of Lemuria, 1932, is still probably the best book on its subject. Lewis Spence died on March 3rd, 1955. Wow. And was succeeded by the British scholar Egerton Sykes. Trained as an engineer, Sykes was a foreign correspondent for the British press, invaluable because of his quadrilingual fluency. During his long life in the diplomatic service and as a Fellow of the Royal Geographical Society, he published an estimated 3 million words in numerous books and magazine articles, many of them devoted to a rational understanding of the Atlantis controversy. Sykes's erudite journals and encyclopedias of comparative myth went a long way in sustaining and expanding interest in Atlantis. Throughout the mid-20th century, he died in 1983, just before his 90th birthday, but a legacy in the form of his large library of Atlantis-related material is preserved in its own room at Edgar Cayce's Association for Research and Enlightenment in Virginia Beach, Virginia. Contrary to mean-spirited characterizations by conservative archaeologists, it says something for the credibility of Atlantis that many of the greatest thinkers in the history of Western civilization have been among its most prominent advocates. We made it. That's the end of that article. And I am going to mark that those 2 pages because I've got some notes I want to take out of there. So, interesting stuff. Um, I've heard other theories about. I think H.P. Blavatsky talks about early people, if not specifically Atlanteans, being telepathic and not actually using language as we know it. That we actually devolved at some point. Um, I think there's also a theory of Plato about people existing in that form, and then being split in half, in like a male and a female half. And I haven't read that theory. I've just heard it in passing. Anyway, some interesting stuff. If you have any comments, always remember these readings will be uploaded to the YouTube channel. Um, Unlike my Star Wars readings, a lot of those cannot be because I'm showing the the comic on stream, so I can't put it anywhere where it's stored permanently. That's part of copyright stuff. Um, so they're only up on um, Twitch for 14 days and then they disappear forever. But these because I'm reading them, I can actually put them on YouTube, so they're there. You can always go back and look at them and make any comments you want. Please do, and I will see them. I check on comments a couple times a week. So yeah, feel free to do that. And next time we will get into Article 21, Atlantis in Antarctica, which should be interesting. Blueprint for Atlantis, which are both like 6 pages. Japan's underwater ruins. Yeah, we've got a ways to go. It's going to be at least 2 sessions before we finish out this section. One of the articles, it looks like it's like 2 pages. Yeah, it's literally 2 pages about Lemuria. So yeah, anyway, we'll get into those. We'll probably do two next time, and then the final 3 after that, and that'll put us into part 5, Ancient High Tech. So next week's reading stream will also be a daytime stream, just so you know. And I don't know after that, so we'll see. But that's it for now. I'm going to take a quick break, and then we'll get into some Fallout 3 for a couple hours before I have to get ready for work. So we'll see you all in a little bit.